Hi guys, here is a short little tutorial on how to get started with watercolor. Yesterday in class we set everything up so that you already have your watercolor paper taped to your board like I have here. Before you move on to any other steps, make sure that you get your picture from the SUP. This is the picture that I've decided to use here. You should have a picture printed out just like this that I printed out yesterday before I left school. So the SUP is supposed to be passing these out. If you don't have yours yet, make sure you ask her about it. And then you also want to make sure that you have all of your watercolors out. You should have 2 yellows. There are 2 different types. Actually, you should have 3. You should also have yellow ochre there. So you should have 3 yellows. You should have 2 blues, 2 reds, an orange, a green, and a brown. And we can make all the colors that we will need to complete our watercolors using these colors here. So just set those to the side. You also want to make sure that you have one of your water buckets out. I am at home, so I'm using my mason jar. Make sure that your paint palette is nice and clean and that you have all of your paint brushes. I have had to add 2 from home because this yellow set that I had left over at school was missing one. Have those out and ready. Make sure that you have a lot of paper towel because you're going to need that. And make sure that you have one of your H pencils. This is a 2H pencil. You guys don't have a 2H, but you definitely have a 3H or an H. So use your H or your 3H because you're going to lightly sketch out your landscape. You don't want the pencil to be real dark or heavy because you don't want it to show through the watercolor. Watercolors are meant to be translucent, not opaque, so the pencil will show through if you press down too hard or if you use a soft lead pencil like one of your B's. Okay? So let's just take a look at my drawing. Or not my drawing, I'm sorry, my picture. Notice that I have a main focal point here in the fence post. And then if we move away towards the center here, this is a 1-point perspective. We've got more fence posts that are gradually close together and getting smaller. We have the lines of the barbed wire fence that will get in there. And then back in the back, kind of center of the page almost, we have my horizon line where the grounds and the sky meet. We've got lots of different values in the grass or the hay of the field here. These are primarily going to come from this color right here called yellow ochre. I may add a little bit of orange at some point and a little bit of brown to grab some of the darker values in here that you see. Definitely going to use this brown to get the fence posts. And then for the sky, I'm going to use phthalo blue or phthalo blue. It's pronounced 2 different ways. I'm sure there's a correct pronunciation for it, but over the years I'm sure I've heard it mispronounced both ways. You could use ultramarine, but ultramarine's going to be more purple or violet. You probably want to stick to this blue here. Okay? Alright. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to sketch out my drawing. And that's what you should do first as well. These are going to be really rough sketches. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. I'm going to put that horizon line in there really quickly. Find the 1-point vanishing point. There's a road that kind of comes down like this. And then from here, we have the fence posts. And then we have the larger fence post here that kind of comes all the way up to the vanishing point, maybe a little over it. And then I'm just going to kind of draw that line in there that represents the barbed wire. Right here, got a little bush that I definitely want to make sure that I get in. I'm going to give that road a little more definition there. And right here, I'm going to try to draw that mountain that I see in the distance. And then behind it, we're going to kind of draw on some atmospheric perspective here. There's a mountain range behind it, but it's a different color. It's like a smoky blue color, and that's because of atmospheric perspective. The colors tend to change, like we said, the farther we get away from the viewer. So it won't be the nice brown that you see here, but it'll be like a blue color. Okay, and then right above that in the sky, we've got a little range of clouds here that we want to draw in. So we want to make sure we get those in a different value. That same range of little clouds is over here. And then right up here in this top corner, we've got something dark, like a little dark cloud here that we definitely want to get in. And I think that's about it. So we're going to go ahead and get started with the painting part. I told you guys yesterday that a little bit of this color, since it comes in such a small tube, a little bit of it goes a long way, because you need to keep in mind that with watercolors, you're not trying to provide a thick, opaque coverage. You're just wanting a translucent coverage. It's supposed to look whimsical and romanticized, not hard-edged and thick coverage. Okay? So with watercolor, you always want to work from your lightest color to your darkest color. You should always do your darkest colors last. And also, since you don't have a white, you're going to use the white of your paper as the white. So in this area here where I have, let me pull this down a little bit, where I have white in the sky, I will leave those areas kind of untouched. I won't put any pigment there, okay? But what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to grab these peachy pink colors underneath here in the sky, in that area right there, and then I'll go over the top of them with blue later. Okay, so to get that kind of pinky peach color, I'm going to take a little bit of my scarlet, I think. Nope, sorry, no. My crimson red. Open it up above your palette, not your paper. And I'm just going to put a small amount, not a lot. Oh, see how it's runny? I'm glad that happened, because that's a good lesson I need to show y'all. Make sure before you start that you kind of squish these up a little bit so that you kind of blend that pigment together with its binder. They've been sitting since August like this, and there's no telling how long they sat in the warehouse before they were shipped to us. These are brand new. You guys are getting fresh watercolors. Be careful or this will happen too. Make sure that you are careful. It'll start squeezing out like it is right now. So I'm just going to kind of put that lid back on there and get that closed. And then I'm going to take a little bit of my yellow ochre. Do the same with it. I'm going to kind of push right here, kind of push that pigment back so that when I open this one up, maybe it doesn't do that so bad. Oh, it still did it. It's just got a lot of pressure on it. So I'm just going to pull that yellow ochre out and try to put it, I may have to take a brush. I'm going to try to put it in a different section. So I'm going to get it all out with my paintbrush. This is a lot of pigment, so you'll use this, very little of that, okay? Gonna put the tube back on. Now I'm gonna take what I have already on this brush, I'm gonna put it in this section. I'm cleaning my paintbrush out. And I'm going to add quite a bit of water to that pigment. So I'm just gonna take my brush really wet adding water to that pigment so that it's more watery than pigment. Now, there's two ways that you can go about this. You can work wet into dry, which means that you have wet pigment that you work onto dry paper, or you can work wet on wet. I prefer wet on wet. And so what I do when I'm working wet on wet before I put any pigment on the paper is I get my paintbrush wet. This paintbrush right here is wet. And since I'm going to be working in this area right here underneath this cloud, I'm just going to wet that area with my paintbrush. Just gently brush water on your paper there. Not too much. You don't want the paper to be sopping wet. Then I'm going to take my paintbrush and I'm going to dip it in the pigment that I was trying to use, just a little at a time, and I'm going to dab it in that area and let it kind of run into that water. Notice how it's giving me these very, very light, translucent colors. That's what you want. You don't want too much at one time because you're going to build upon that color. So if you'll look at my area here in my picture, that's exactly what I wanted. That light color. Now I'm going to go all the way over to the other side with it. So I'm going to get my brush wet and I'm going to go over here and I'm going to dampen this area too. And again, I'm going to take the watered down pigment and I'm going to apply it in those areas. A little bit at a time, because a little bit of pigment goes a long way. Okay, now there's some rose undertones in there. So I'm going to take this brush, I'm going to clean it off, I'm going to dry that up, and I'm going to take some of this not scarlet, but crimson pigment, crimson red pigment, just a little bit, not a lot, and I'm going to put it over here, get my brush really wet, and water down that pigment. And I mean really water it down, you guys. And be real careful when you're working. It's probably not a wise idea for you to reach over your paper like I'm doing, so I'm going to move this water down here closer to me, so that if I drop anything, I drop it on the area outside my paper and not on my paper. Because you don't want water to fall on there in a tinted color. Now I'm going to take that rose color and I'm just going to gently go over the top of that in the areas where it has pink pigment. And that's going to give us some of those rosy undertones. Like that. Okay? Now, if you'll look right in here, there's a little bit of blue that kind of washes over that. So I'm going to get my blue. I'm going to put a little bit of blue on my palette. Gonna take my clean brush, get just a small amount of that pigment and put it over here. And then again, I'm gonna water the pigment down. I mean, add lots of water to it, where it looks kind of almost like Kool-Aid. And then I'm just gonna gently go over that area with blue. And I'm just kind of dabbing. I'm not really like brushing like you normally would. Just kind of dabbing that color on there, because as it hits that wet paper, it starts to bleed. And that's kind of what you want there, is the bleed through. I'm going to get this part of my paper wet right here. Like I said, don't saturate it. If you feel like you've gotten too much water in an area, let it dry, and come back to it later. There's no need to keep working an area, because if you keep working it and it's too wet, the paper will start to flake up and you'll have a mess. Okay? Now, notice how this area in here on my picture is more translucent than the area right above it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and get that area wet, because I know I want to work in it. So I'm going to rub that area down. Dry my brush off really good, and I'm going to get some more of my blue pigment. I'm going to put some more of that pigment over here. But this time, I'm not going to add as much water. I'm going to leave it a little more opaque. And I'm going to go in and I'm going to dab just like I did before, but this time see how it has a more opaque coverage. That's kind of what you want. Like that. And I would keep doing this until I got the whole area covered how I wanted it to be covered. Make sure that you leave the white areas white. Don't put any pigment in your white areas. But even though this is a more opaque pigment, you can tell that I still have a lot of translucent areas, and that's what you want. That's what it's supposed to be, because this is watercolor. It's not acrylic. It's not tempera. Make sure that you're not adding too much pigment. It needs to be really watered down, even when you're doing more opaque coverage. I'm going to leave that area in there for the white. Like so. I'm going to go down in here near the horizon line and start trying to get that mountain range in there. Now I'm going to go over that with a little bit of rose to kind of give it that gray feeling. I'm going to clean my brush out. Just kind of dab that with the rose color to give it that gray feeling. Now, I could keep going on and on in this demo and do that whole sky for you, but I feel like you probably get the point now. Like I said before, I like to work wet on wet. I suggest that you try to work wet on wet. If you were going to do the bottom part, I'll go ahead and show you. We've got our ochre here, our yellow ochre. We would make sure that we get all the blue out of our brush. Grab some of this yellow ochre pigment, put it back over here. Water it down really well. I'm going to make sure that I wet my paper first. So I want to work wet on wet. And then I'd start adding this yellow ochre color. And remember what I said about how you might want to use a little orange, or I might even would want to use a little brown in here. So I could go back in and I could add a little orange to this palette. Take a little bit of it, put it over here, water it down, and I could apply that in there too, and it would kind of warm it up a little bit more. But I would do that all the way throughout this area. Now, once you got let's say that I got all this down in here. Make sure I'm working a little wet there. Once I got this whole area covered with yellow ochre, I could go in with a smaller brush and my brown, because if you notice there's some brown areas in here. I can get my brown open. There we go. Grab a little bit of that brown pigment, dilute it. Oh, see how I did that over my paper? You don't want to do that. Keep your palette away from your paper. Don't do like I did. Luckily that landed on my tape. Anyhow, I'd take a smaller brush like this and take some of that pigment, and I would go in and I would build up areas, and you may even have to like use less diluted pigment. Excuse me. And I'd just build up the areas that were supposed to be darker. You can always go in with a little bit of water and dilute those even more. I got a little too much water there. See what can happen when you get too much water? You want to be real careful about stuff like that. I can go back in with my brush, get my yellow ochre, try to bleed that out some more. Make it look more realistic. But remember, if an area feels like it's getting too soggy, let it go. Come back to it later. You can always go back to it after it's dried. Okay? Alrighty, I hope this helps. I hope this gives y'all a good start. Like I said yesterday, if you have any questions, make sure that you send me an email. If you're in class, if you're out of class and you're at home, you can always send me a remind message. I hope everything works out, and I look forward to seeing your watercolors when I get back to school on Wednesday.